Human ecology, the interaction between human and nature. But in this podcast, I'm going to use that term in the way that Pope John Paul II meant it. In 1991, he said, quote, "People are rightly worried about preserving natural habitats," and he noted the, quote, "irrational destruction of the natural environment." But he went on, quote, "Too little effort is made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. Man must respect the natural and moral structure with which he has been endowed." End quote. In exploring this idea, we'll go into economics and social sciences, history, philosophy, and yes, even Catholic social teaching, all with a focus on human flourishing. We'll go into the natural environment as well along the way because, as I'll unpack in a few weeks, you can't look at the human without looking at his environment. It's all connected. However, the focus of the podcast will be people and society. I'm Matt Unicum, and this is Human Ecology. My first guest is someone I've known for a long time, but mainly from afar. I built up questions for her over the years, and I was thrilled that she'd be my first guest. Her name is Trisha Jha. She's a research fellow in the education program at the Centre for Independent Studies, or CIS, a think tank, and a former teacher. We share a similar intellectual background and a similar career trajectory, both teaching for several years in between our policy work. Her work focuses on teaching, and she's an advocate of direct instruction and the science of learning as evidence-based teaching practices. But we dig into broader aspects of her work in teaching and policy and things that we have in common. Trisha's an interesting person, and each time I listen to this episode, I discover more to unpack and contemplate. Here's my interview from earlier this year with Trisha Jha. I first asked her to outline her career journey.
So when you and I met, I was at university at the ANU doing an arts degree, and that's probably where I became really interested in politics and political philosophy. So doing an introduction to politics course as sort of, you kind of came to university with all these assumptions around the political, sphere. Like, if you were left wing, it meant that you wanted more government, but you were also very sort of socially liberal. And if you were right wing, you wanted very, very free markets, but you wanted everything else to be really socially regulated. And so when I came to university, I was probably more in that first camp. But then when I was at university and studying and looking more into things like the history of the Liberal Party, I can't even remember how I got onto it. I think it was almost accidental at some point in my first year. I learned more about the history of the Liberal Party, particularly it's the liberal part of the Liberal Party. Why was it called the Liberal Party? So learning more about, that tradition that you and I would call classical liberalism, not that it was the super strong influence in the history of the Australian Liberal Party, but obviously the Liberal parties around the world tend to have a much stronger classical liberal influence. But anyway, that just kind of broadened my horizons in terms of how I understood politics to be. It wasn't just kind of that sort of simplistic, division between two sets of ideologies that I'd thought of. It was actually much more complicated than that. So I think I eventually ended up at some point identifying as a classical liberal and reading Hayek and things like that. And at the end of my second year of uni, I went to a program called Liberty and Society, which is run by the Centre for Independent Studies, which is where I ended up as my first job out of university, just sort of a part-time research assistant role, which eventually turned into full-time. And I sort of started off working in sort of social policy, so family payments, and then moving into childcare because that was a big budget line item at the time, still is really. And then eventually, after kind of an internal rearrangement, I came under the wing of Jennifer Buckingham, who was running the education program at the time. And so while we were there, we kind of had that, very, I don't want to say ideological as though it's a bad thing, but definitely because of the sort of philosophy of the CIS always historically being very aligned with that classical liberal free market, those free market principles, the sort of approach that we took in the education program while I was there the first time was definitely more around those structural elements of education. So things like school choice, charter schools We didn't do heaps on vouchers, but the CIS had published things on vouchers in the past. So the kind of things that I'd published, there was 2 papers on and schools that I published with Jen. One of them was about charter schools and different charter school models that existed in various countries, and basically looking at how you might apply those lessons here. And the second paper was about basically school choice. So we're happy with this idea of diversity, this idea we've got 3 different school sectors, and parents can kind of choose where they want to go with, I guess, in our funding systems is sort of like a partial voucher system as well, which provides a lot more choice by default to Australian families compared to some other nations around the world. But one of the things that I also learned while I was there was that how important teaching quality was to student outcomes. So to the extent that things like charter schools and school choice were effective policy mechanisms, it was because they exerted, or they trickled down, I guess, to teaching quality, and outcomes were the kind of the direct outcome was from teaching quality. So that kind of got me thinking about the importance of teaching as a profession. And I sort of thought that if I wanted to stay in education policy, that it would make sense to become a teacher. And at the same time, I'd also been thinking about leaving Sydney. I'd sort of grown up there and I'd sort of come back for work, but I didn't really feel like I'd made a choice to live there as such, in the same way that I'd chosen to move to Canberra for university. I applied for Teach for Australia, which is it's probably a lot of people in New South Wales probably aren't aware of it, because it's not really, I think it only lasted for a year in New South Wales, if that. But it was basically, it's a program that runs in most states and territories around Australia, and it basically recruits high achieving graduates, career changers, and later in life professionals who already hold a bachelor's degree and have kind of like some experience in a relevant area, to basically fast track them through a Masters of Teaching. And so they study side doing their first 2 years of teaching, which is really tough. But that's how I ended up in Horsham, in Western Victoria, which is about maybe 800-900 k's away from Sydney, which is where I was born and where I grew up. But that was a really tremendous experience. And so I taught there for a few years. Then I got engaged to someone who was living in Melbourne and moved to Melbourne, and then worked in politics for a little while. Was working as an advisor to Michael O'Brien when he was the opposition leader at the Victorian Liberal Party. And that was during COVID. So Michael and I had these conversations when I'd sort of first come on board about how he was really keen on education, but like with a lot of things, COVID just kind of ruined everything. So I did a little bit of education, but probably not as much as I wanted to. As happens in politics, there's a change at the top, which is what happened. So Michael lost the leadership. And while I wasn't fired by Matthew Guy when he came in as leader, it was definitely not really something that I wanted to keep doing, because I sort of didn't really see myself as like a political staffer or a professional staffer, because I'd never done it before. I really sort of saw myself as someone who wanted to work for Michael. And so if he wasn't leader, then I didn't see too much point for me. At that point, I was already living in Ballarat, so we'd already moved, my husband and I, sort of halfway through COVID, beginning of sort of 2021. And I took the opportunity to work at a school here locally. Did that for about 18 months before we realised it kind of, the sort of lack of flexibility of teaching wasn't really compatible with my husband's working lifestyle. It kind of demands of his job, which kind of require him to work in December and January really intensively, which of course, if you're a teacher, that's literally the time when you've got off. And so it just wasn't working for him to be at his busiest point when I was at my least busy point, and it just kind of wasn't sensible. So I basically decided to leave about halfway through last year, travelled for a little bit and started at the CIS again, this time working remotely as a research fellow in education in August of 2023, and I've been here ever since.
Interesting. There's a few similarities there. One of them being that I also went to Liberty and Society, had that opportunity, and that was pretty transformational. That was awesome. I also encountered Hayek at university. Also went to ANU. But I went in pretty naive and not understanding much.
Did you sort of get involved in, was it Young Libs, or was it a temperamental thing that saw you moving towards classical liberalism, or was it something your professors taught you, or how do you think you went down that track?
Yeah, so it's funny you ask about a professor because there was one classical liberal professor that I could think of at ANU, but I actually didn't know he was a classical liberal many years later. The person I'm thinking of is Jeremy Shermer, who took intro to philosophy.
Oh, good.
And I think other than the fact that he taught us about, Nozick and, Night Watchman State and those sorts of theories, I just thought that it was just like, oh yeah, this is just the full gamut of all philosophy. I didn't realize that he was kind of coming to that work as a classical liberal and wanting us to get that breadth on that side as well. I mean, yeah, so Jerry Sherman was fantastic, but I don't know that I could say that he influenced me because like I said, didn't know that he was a classical liberal. But I actually think that one of the formative experiences I had was, as I said, I sort of started out this like lefty. And during O Week, I actually went to a socialist alternative meeting. And yeah, I know, it's very funny. But it was actually really instructive because we had this conversation around like, oh, so what do you guys, you're advocating for revolution, like what happens to people? And, I came from a family of, my parents are skilled migrants. My father, has kind of made a living for most of his life now, running a small business. So starting and running a small business. And so I kind of approached that conversation with the socialists as like, so what happens to small business owners in this sort of revolutionary grand idea that you've got? And the guy I was speaking to was like, oh, they can kind of go either way. And I'm like, as in, they're either on the side of the revolution or, they're first against the wall kind of thing. And I was like, actually, I don't think I'm down for an ideology that would have that view. Like, that's like, I was kind of raised with my parents' values in that respect. So I think there was probably a little bit of I think that kind of helped having that extreme experience. But I think it was kind of some of the people I just sort of ended up talking to online, and I think I just found some of the classical liberals to be more interesting and thought about things a lot harder, as opposed to some of the ways that I'd heard other people speak about politics, which was literally just like, oh, I like this, therefore the government should do this, or oh, I don't like this, therefore the government shouldn't allow people to do this thing. Whereas I found like that, I guess that principled idea of I can have a set of values, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily need to be shared by everyone in society. So I think I found that kind of more intellectually interesting as probably part of it. But I wasn't terribly involved with the young libs at university.
Interesting. And then that raises so many questions, but I think we'll come to them later. Another follow-up is around the CAS. You sort of talked about how your thinking evolved over time from the more structural to the more like, I guess, pedagogical. Do you think, did the CAS, to the degree you can share, did they sort of have a bit of a like practical change where they, it was more like, let's change the system, and now it's like, let's work within the system, let's maximize the teaching, and play that game rather than a different game, which is, I've considered reform of education in New South Wales for a while. In fact, thinking about your 2017 Libertarian Society speech, where you basically, I think you said you don't want to blow things up, it's not realistic. That was a 2017 speech from memory. So obviously you'd come to that view by then, and now you're working more on the science of learning. Do you think the CAS kind of, I guess I knew you were in the CAS, but like Dr. Buckingham and the official approach, was there sort of a conscious change or an evolution, or how do you see that?
So I think probably I sort of left maybe as that transition was happening. Looking back on it now, I think that so Jennifer was running this campaign called 5 from 5, which was really about running an effective campaign that worked on two levels. One was a sort of that traditional almost lobbying campaign where her purpose was to use the research, in particular some of the stuff she'd done on her PhD on early literacy, to sort of change policy, in particular bringing in the year one phonics screening check, and basically change the way, or just kind of change the way that reading was taught in Australian schools. But also the other side of that campaign was sort of like more of an information campaign for leaders, for school, for teachers, and for parents as well. So it was about, I guess, rating a critical mass of people. So in order to get change happening. So noticing that you can't have policy change that's rejected or not accepted by, I guess, industry is how I'd phrase it. And the reverse won't work either. You can't just have expect that policymakers are going to listen to teachers and industry people just because the context is so different. So, I mean, I wouldn't have a clue what happened in the interim but sort of between 2017 and 2023, as I wasn't working there. But certainly when I came back, we've sort of maintained that almost the 5 from 5 was almost like, I guess, the prototype, where we've kind of got like a dual pronged approach now, where we are trying to work with policymakers, although that's generally about trying to be clever, about recognizing that policymakers are always going to have a certain degree of power, and it's about ensuring that they use it in the right way, but also working with the sector more broadly to, I guess, empower educators, principals, and parents to some extent as well, with the research that's accessible. And if you kind of work on both of those halves, that's how you get change.
Interesting. I remember you talking in your speech about experiments, and I thought that was, policy experiments. And if Dr. Buckingham's sort of gone off and she's doing, I guess she's implementing to some degree what she kind of researched, right? So thinking about, say, CIS's model for change, I've heard that they sort of think long term. I saw John Ruddick on Twitter the other day say that his party, the Libertarian Party's targeting the top 10%. And I guess in some sense, whatever 10% that is, I don't know if that's 10% of money or 10% of IQ or whatever it might be, I'm not sure. But I guess the elites is kind of what he's saying. And that's where a lot of the action seems to be. But you make a good point, like, can you get change without actually doing some experiments on the ground, implementing things, and having sort of a top down, bottom up approach to change over the long term? Is that kind of how the CIS sees it?
So I think it's important to think about what it is that we want to achieve. And I think if you start with the end goal, then you'll find that some people really don't want to achieve the same thing. And so you're kind of talking at cross purposes. So for me, and especially given my experience in 2 different secondary schools in 2 very different, one kind of more disadvantaged, one was a private school with, not super high fees, but, was a fee paying or fee charging school. We sort of think about how can we create policy system or a sector where every single child has the opportunity to learn and to achieve in line with their sort of natural talents and ability, and that their background or no other factor restricts them from doing that. So if that's sort of the starting point, then I think by definition you have to be looking at what's actually happening in the classroom, because that's where teaching is happening. That's where learning's happening. And so once you look at it from there, then you cannot just be talking to teachers, because teachers' work is so circumscribed and guided by policy. So we have things like, national testing and curriculum and all that sort of stuff, which requires a policymaker, or I guess what you might call policy elite, I suppose, although I really don't like that word, that sort of end of things as well, but also the reverse is true, because you definitely can't get industry on board with changes and policies that are seen to be non-responsive to the needs of that sector or that industry. And I think that just goes for any sort of social change or any kind of large scale change at all. So I think that's, if you sort of start from that point, then you kind of work your way backwards in terms of, well, what are the things that need to change in order to generate that outcome? But on the other hand, if you're a parent, then, your concern from a policy perspective may not actually be the quality of education for all children. You may just really care about having the ability to send, your child to a school that aligns with your values. Or you might be a homeschooler, and your primary, I guess, when you're thinking about what are the chief ends of an education system, it's to give parents more control and more influence and more power over their child's education without the influence of, I guess, government or other sort of agencies or other kind of elites. So I think you can have people that might sort of have a similar sort of view on various other things, like politics, for instance, and then when you actually talk to them about what is it that you actually think an education system should do, or what should be the way that we sort of frame and think about changing, and then you might find that you actually have very different views. So, and I don't know that those things are necessarily reconcilable.
Yeah, super complex. It's a tough tough space, and like you've seen both sides of it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next. But why don't we get back to your narrative? Talk to us about your time entering schools and what you experienced, how things, what you saw, how it aligned with expectations, what you saw the issues were, how did your thinking change? Take us through a bit of a story of your time in teaching.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I definitely think that the first sort of 6 months to a year of classroom teaching in 2017 was it was a really, really tough year, but also one of those really influential and impactful years. So I think one of the first things that I started to realize is that schools feel very, very far apart or far away from where decisions are made. So I remember that was I think it was the federal budget in May, and I have group chat with friends that are involved in politics or public servants or whatever, and they're pinging each other in the group chat about, oh, this budget measure, that budget measure, and things like that, or they're just talking about it. And I just remember thinking, this is the first time in years where it doesn't even affect me at all. And the reality is, though, budgets absolutely affect schools. I mean, for instance, I know for a fact that when I arrived at the school I was teaching at, that they were just finishing up some rebuild of part of the campus that had been, but the reason why they were able to rebuild that school was because it had been funded in a budget by the state government a few years earlier. So actually, when my old boss, Michael O'Brien, was treasurer, so I remember reading the budget papers thinking, yeah, that's my school, he funded that. So, these things do make a difference, but at the end of the day-to-day of the school is so far away from all of that. And I remember at some point some of the kids I taught decided to Google me, and they found some videos of me from the CIS YouTube channel and from Q&A and some of the other television appearances that I'd had. And they were amazed, and they were like, what were you doing on TV? And I was like, well, before I became a teacher, I had this other job where I used to talk about, education policy, and, I don't think I used the word policy because I don't think they would have understood it, but I would have said something like, when people in charge make decisions, I used to write or talk about that. And they were just like, so what are you doing teaching us? And that was really instructive because on the one hand, it was kind of funny and embarrassing that they Googled me and that they were doing that sort of stuff. And it's like, oh, it's a little bit weird. But on the other hand, the way that they responded, I thought was really instructive because it showed that the kids in front of me did not really expect that the teachers in front of them were there because they wanted to be there. For them, it was kind of like, yeah, this is a job that you do. This is a school that you come to if you don't have any other option. And so they couldn't really fathom someone who would give up a life of what they saw as, maybe being more interesting or more glamorous or whatever in a big city and come to a town of, 20,000 people with one government high school. So that was kind of really humbling in a way because, I had all these sort of grand ideas about things and, I was always really engaged with the education research. But for a lot of the sort of staff that I spoke to and that I kind of interacted with, it was kind of like, I'd love to be able to engage with these big ideas around, well, that term didn't really exist at the time, but, science of learning or explicit teaching or, how do we do behavior and routines? And, I'd love to have all the desks in rows, but what's that going to mean when I'm actually trying to teach these kids in period 2 and I don't have the time in a 45-minute period to rearrange all the desks into the way that I want them to, then teach and then rearrange them all back again. It was sort of like realizing that you kind of got swept up in just the waves, I guess, the day-to-day, like the crash and roil of waves, just in the same way that you go to the ocean and it just is what it is. Like there's nothing, everything in the water just kind of follows the rules of what's going on in that giant complex system. So it sort of felt a little bit like that at times. It's kind of like, well, you kind of needed to keep your eyes on, what's happening with the kids. And I think the kids, like most of them are really nice. There's I kind of realized that there's a group of kids, and depending on what kind of context you're in, that could be either a small minority or a sizable minority. There's a group of kids that will do the right thing pretty much no matter what. There's a group of kids that will always be really, really hard to be on task. Again, depending on the context, it could either be a small minority or a significant minority. And there's a group of kids in the middle where the work that you do in terms of setting the classroom culture is going to be the determinant of whether they are compliant and engaged, whether they're compliant and disengaged, or whether they're non-compliant and disengaged. So it's kind of going to depend on a lot of the work that you do. And I do feel like in general, it's one of those things that's really hard for schools to get right. But it also just made it clear to me that we could talk a lot about, teaching and, this is how we should arrange this unit and this is how we should think about what kids are learning, or this is how we should think about learning intentions and success criteria, or these are the activities we should be doing. But something like setting that classroom culture is so important, but it was also something that I had very little influence on as a teacher on my own. So it was that constant struggle, feeling like you're at the mercy of forces bigger than yourself. And I think a lot of teachers didn't even realize that that was the case, that there's so many things about teacher life that are decided outside of the individual teacher's actual life. I mean, one example is that at the first school I taught at, every 10 minutes, every morning, you'd have house group or form group or whatever, where you'd take the roll, and it'd literally be 10 minutes of the kids come in, they settle in, you mark the roll and you read them the notices. So if someone needs to go to a meeting or whatever, then they've got, year 8 boys basketball, go see Mr. So-and-so in the gym or whatever. But when you kind of have 10 minutes every day, that's 50 minutes. And when you have 50-minute periods, that's the equivalent of that's the equivalent of one whole period of teacher time that's being used on that task. And I remember speaking to someone who had been a principal. He said that one of the first things that they'd done when he became principal of the school that he had been at was to actually get rid of that time. And he said, "No, we'll do the roll call in lesson 1 in period 1, and that's it." And he said that the reason he did that was because if they have 50 minutes of I guess that teaching time or that face-to-face time, because obviously all of this is tightly regulated through the enterprise bargaining agreement. That's 50 minutes per teacher that he could be using for so many other things. And just thinking about teacher time in that way was something that I think was really foreign to a lot of people, at least to ordinary classroom teachers. And same thing, I was really struggling to develop curriculum in the subject that I was teaching, which was Spanish, because it had been taught at year 7 and year 8. And then there was a year 9 class in my first year, so I had to write that from scratch. Then they moved up to year 10 and I had to write that from scratch. And then there was a year 10 and 11 combined class, so I had to integrate what I'd done with year 10 with new stuff for year 11. And I was doing all of this on my own. And I remember I said this to someone, I was just like, wouldn't it be just easier if there was just something that was fully aligned to the Victorian curriculum, fully resourced, and I could just adapt it to suit my context, to suit my lesson length or to suit whatever. And the person I was talking to, who was a teacher, is more experienced than I was, but still early career, she was like, I'd never even thought about it that way. And so it was amazing, because it just made you think that there's so many things that don't even get thought about the way that we do teaching at the moment. It's not teachers' fault. It's just why would they think about something like that? Like, it's not something that they feel is in their capacity to change. So I think that kind of made it clear to me that I do really, obviously teaching and the act of teaching really matters, but you're also at the mercy of forces far bigger than your control, which kind of means that you really do need to think about the bigger picture and the policy and the decision making too, in order to maximize the impact of teachers in the classroom.
Yep, 100%. Did you sort of go armed with the science or some sort of, science of learning type approach? Had you had good rigorous knowledge on that, at least from your time at CAS going into teaching? And did you get some of that in your initial teacher education, or did you see a big disparity between what you knew and then the quality of the teacher education you had? How equipped were you?
So I hadn't engaged a whole lot with the actual sort of teaching side of things. I knew a little bit about reading instruction, and I knew a lot about, I guess, a little bit about explicit teaching practices, or not so much the practices, but more about this idea that explicit teaching was an evidence-based practice. So I knew those sorts of things, and I've got to say, like, it wasn't at all supported in the university learning that I did. So, the textbook that I was assigned, that was kind of like the core textbook for my ITE, which was through Deakin University, was it had some section about explicit teaching in it, and And I was remember reading it and I was thinking, but none of the people that I know, none of the kind of teachers and researchers and people that I'd sort of connected with and whose work I'd started following through Jen and through CIS and those sorts of connections, I was like, none of these people are talking about these researchers. So I don't know why this person is being quoted as an authority on explicit teaching, because this just seems very weird. Like, where's the, where are this cognitive load stuff? Where's the science? Where's the memory? Like, where's all that stuff that was being written about in other books that I was reading? So stuff like, Daisy Christodoulou's 7 Myths About Education, or David Ditto and Nick Rose's book, What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology. Like, these are books that I was sort of picking up through the sort of networks that I had, and they weren't being discussed at all in my ITE, to the point that I remember I tried to say something in my sort of initial intensive before I started teaching. So this is when I was doing like the university. I was doing like 4 subjects at once of university in the sort of January period before teaching. I remember saying something, and I think I was talking about the fact that the science really suggests that there's actually one way to teach, that at least that, there's, well, at the very least, I was saying that there wasn't such things as things like, learning styles or whatever, that there wasn't really evidence to suggest that, if you have 30 kids in a room, 30 kids are going to learn in fundamentally different ways. And I remember the kind of tutor was very sarcastically saying, it was like, oh, if only all kids are all the same. And I'm like, but there's a difference between saying every student is a unique individual, which they are, and the next bit, which is therefore they all need to be taught in very, very different ways. The first statement is defensible and true. The second one is not true at all, and only vaguely defensible. I kind of realized quickly that I was not gonna necessarily find friends in that. And so I just kind of, my university assignments are fairly easy for me to write because I'd been used to doing research and stuff at CIS, so I was able to just churn them out pretty quickly. And so I ended up with decent grades, but I definitely don't think I necessarily learned a whole heap, other than, some stuff that was vaguely interesting, but it definitely felt like the connection between my university and my teaching was very, very off kilter. And I feel like maybe more, I sort of was able to see that more than perhaps the traditional traditional sort of teacher, pre-service teacher, because they've got these big gaps between, where they're doing university and then they're doing prac, and then they're doing university and then they're doing prac. Because for me, it was sort of almost side by side. I think for me, I was able to see much more clearly how useless a lot of it really was.
Yeah, that rings a bell too. Luckily, we learnt cognitive load stuff. I think Sweller is he from UNSW? So we learnt his stuff. But there was also a lot of Hattie and a lot of differentiation. Like, that was a key focus, which I actually found to be quite impossible and unreasonable to expect. But I was also, in addition to the pedagogical stuff, which some was useful, and the I actually think on the job training would be better than a lot of the and maybe whilst studying formally as well would be better than sort of how they do it. You could also sort of earn a living while you're studying, and then slowly learning, moving up in the business. But I was also reading sort of radical. Like, it's probably not a good idea to be reading Murray Rothbard when you're going into a very centralized education system. But it was very interesting to read him, and I sort of went in pretty hardcore classical liberal, and actually one of the issues I found was just the being sort of a Hayekian at that time, like the coercion involved in a compulsory centralized system, I just found really hard, and I didn't like sort of having to force kids to do things, which kind of gets to one of my points about education, which is that I think in terms of scalability, you really need if you don't have great pedagogy and great systems, a great school, well set up and designed, you kind of need really compelling teachers, and I think only probably maybe 20% of teachers are really at that level. So therefore, it's not scalable unless you change things fundamentally from what they are now in terms of the approach to teaching. So I wasn't one of those top 20%. I had some health issues as well, so my teaching time was pretty hamstrung by that. So philosophical issues, probably not the best teacher training, but not the worst. And then going in, not feeling the greatest as well. I found it quite hard, and maybe I'll just read out my diary entry from the end of first year to you. You can give me a reaction if you want. My first year of teaching revealed an education system rife with contradictions and problems. I spent my first year as a teacher in a state of internal conflict. There was a set of assumptions and practices that prevailed that ran counter to what seemed to work or to what seemed sensible. And a couple of things I mentioned, the difficulty of differentiating my teaching to 30 students, the amount of coercion involved, the gap between like what students needed to bring to be successful. A lot of kids had social problems at home. They had a lot of other things to concentrate on before they got to the classroom, so they were sort of starting behind the eight ball. And then some of them might have needed therapy or other interventions before they could really genuinely deeply learn. Competition with other competing sources of entertainment like phones, having to compete with phones, and students maybe not having the goal of learning but wanting to maximize status, for example, in the school. And I finished my diary entry, so that was just a snippet, but pluralism in curriculum and delivery will be critical going forward, which necessarily requires government to loosen the reins. So I was very much in the mindset of liberalising the education system. I did read some of your papers at the CIS on reform charter schools at that time, so I found that really, really interesting. But I also went down, as you might have seen me on Twitter, annoying some people talking about free schooling, democratic free schooling, stuff like that. That's kind of the headspace I was in. I wasn't like, how can I be the best teacher at this time? I was like, there's a lot of things wrong with this system, and we need to change it. But I guess that's kind of a slightly different way that you went. But I mean, that was my experience, and I had a great time. But I'm also glad to be out of it. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, so that's a really, really great contribution, and thank you for sharing. I think what you were saying about kids having sort of different things going on in their lives and maybe different priorities when it comes to school, those things I think are really important to recognize. But what we do about them, what's the adequate response, I think is where people will tend to have a philosophical difference. And I genuinely think this is a philosophical difference. One school says that, well, one school of thought, and pun not intended, says that, because kids have got these issues, that means that there's going to be a whole lot of kids that are not suited to various types of school. And therefore, the first thing that we should be doing is trying to find a different way for them to engage in school. And the second school of thought is sort of like, well, we live in a society where they are going to need to have certain skills in order to thrive. And just because as children they are not in a space where they are, feel that those things are valuable or important, and they don't have that sort of long-term thinking, or, whatever's going on in their lives is sort of being a big thing in their sort of teenage brain. That doesn't mean that the first response from the adults should be to indulge that surface level response. It should be to sort of dig deeper and try to kind of set rules around, well, what's happening in this space is what we can control in this way. And there's actually a certain amount of power in being able to say, it actually doesn't necessarily have to impact you what's happening outside of your life. Like, it doesn't have to be something that is your destiny. And I worry that people who naturally gravitate towards the first school of thought will end up, and I don't want to say this word in the negative connotation that it's got. I mean, if you indulge that urge of a child or a teenager to, I guess, do some of those things that you're talking about, like, compete for status, or, kind of, I guess they're really kind of worried about what else is going on in their lives or in their social life or their family life, you're kind of not really giving them a chance to grow. If you just let them follow their own interests or their own inclinations or their own passions. And I think there's a whole school of philosophy around that our passions shouldn't necessarily be what guides us. And I guess, yeah, it might be sort of the thing that the Trish and Matt of 10, 12 years ago might say is really paternalistic and things like that. But I think that there's a certain amount of value in it. So one of the projects I did recently was to, we sort of interviewed a bunch of teachers that were sort of identified themselves as sort of being science of learning, so a lot of explicit teaching, a lot of stuff around how the brain influences learning and using that to inform teaching. But people were also really lucid about the bigger picture and what they saw as a sort of the social goal of education. And we'd have people saying things like, that your job as a teacher is to kind of equip the kid in front of you with, the sort of that corpus of knowledge, which is their entitlement as a citizen of this nation and of this society. And so in some ways, it's a much more, I guess you could say it is a more collectivist notion of education and what it's for. But I think I would kind of describe it as like civic nationalism. So we believe in education, not so much, obviously economic success is part of it, but it's not the only part. We do live in a society where they are going to have certain skills and knowledge in order to succeed economically, but we want them to succeed economically, not so that they keep the wheels of capital moving or whatever the sort of parody ideas are about seeing an economic dimension to schooling, but so it's a way of them achieving a sense of success and a sense of ownership and agency in their own lives. And I think this is all the more important rather than less when you've got kids that come from really chaotic backgrounds and have, might be in and out of poverty, or might have parents with serious issues, or come from like a broken home where they don't necessarily have that sort of sense of parental stability. It's about actually giving them the tools and the knowledge that they need to potentially break the cycle that they've been raised in. And so I think when you kind of look at it from that way, it does come across a lot more social justice oriented. It does come across a lot more, I guess, collectivist. But if we sort of think about it that way, that we do kind of all live in a society and we do really want people to live in a way where they are, empowered to participate rather than being at the mercy of others. I think that's a critical thing to any society, I would think, but especially for those who would identify themselves as being of a more classical liberal or small government bent.
I was actually thinking what you were saying, it sounded almost like a little bit of a tip towards more of a conservative view. Have your views sort of moved that way? I know mine have over my 20s and into my 30s. The classical liberal view, kind of, you see the limits of that, and going back into policy, like right now I just love more of a classical liberal government, but the conservatives seem to have more of a substantial rather than procedural view of things, and that's that often fills gaps. So what you said really resonated with me, but would you sort of say that you've sort of shifted that way a little bit over time, not just with teaching but in your thinking generally with policy and life?
Yeah, so I think that there were always, particularly around some of the stuff that the CIS has done in the past on family structure and sort of family policy, there's always been a strong conservative element at CIS, which is sort of something I was exposed to and engaged with, but wouldn't necessarily have identified with personally at the time. But then moving to where I did, it's sort of vindicated, not everything, but a little bit of what the kind of conservatives were sort of saying, in the sense that and it's not about sort of blaming anybody for the situation that they end up in, but you could definitely see how there were kids that were the victim of, I guess, what we these days might call, Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs. So these ideas that there's kind of decisions that were made by people who were sort of rich enough to insulate themselves from the consequences of things like, I guess, drug use, or a very kind of casual approach to relationships and family formation, and a very kind of, maybe casual approach to things like discipline or boundaries for children. So these things that, for a certain group of society, it doesn't really matter to them whether or not they have them. But if that becomes the social norm that then trickles down into other less privileged parts of society, that has the capacity to really wreak havoc. And that's sort of what I saw in my first few years of teaching. But I also got to see how, like, poverty wasn't necessarily the determinant of what was going on in a kid's future. And one of the really kind of obvious ways is that there were, like, the Horsham wasn't the most multicultural town in the world, but there was actually a bit of a refugee population. And, a lot of those kids were coming from backgrounds where parents didn't speak English at all, and the kids themselves were EAL, so English as an additional language. But the effort that they put in, and it's not to say that they were, the best students in the whole class, but a lot of them were trying really hard, and it kind of just shows that some of this does come down to values. And the question is, are we going to live in a society, how do you cultivate those values on a community-wide scale? And it seems to me that we need to think about government that, I guess, creating the right set of incentives, good values that actually empower and free people in a real sense, not free in the sense of no boundaries, but free in the sense of enable people to take real agency over their lives. You need to have a little bit more of a sophisticated view of government. And I remember even before that, I was thinking about things like, it's so expensive living in a city, but you could kind of move, you could allow people to have different types of lifestyle without sacrificing their economic prospects, if you had a way of creating, more kind of connected satellite towns. If we had, I was living in Victoria, obviously Victoria's a really compact state, but I was thinking of, if let's say we did spend, $20-40 billion on high-speed rail to connect places like Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, Gippsland, Albury, Wodonga, even into Melbourne, where the economic opportunities of the city become much more accessible, but the lifestyle opportunities of the country or regional towns are also more accessible to everybody. I think that, would that result in net human flourishing? I feel like it probably would, but, the whole concept of, if you told me 10 years ago that I might be considering, spending $40 billion on high-speed rail might be actually a good thing, then I would have laughed in your face. So, but those sorts of questions around what are the clever and intelligent ways that governments kind of use their power, because it's not going away, to act in a way that actually might empower individuals. And I think that's probably the difference. Walking that balance, I think, is really hard. And there's definitely a trend on the right to basically forget all of the economic lessons that we learned from classical liberals and be like, industry policy is great. And it's like, no, mate, it was terrible during, it was terrible 50 years ago, it was terrible 100 years ago, and it's still terrible now. But at least be opening up the conversation around where the right and effective means are for government intervention. I would definitely say I'm much more open to having those conversations.
I guess thinking where to go next, maybe you can, because we're running up on time, maybe could you sort of round out how you sort of exited teaching? How did you leave it? Do you want to go back? What do you see your mission is now? Do you see yourself more as a policy person, a teacher person? You go back and forth. What do you see going forward?
So I don't think I'm likely to be going back into teaching, just because of the various kind of personal reasons that led me to leave in the first instance. Those aren't really coming back. Also, the VITs, even though I'm currently registered for non-practicing status, they're chasing me for audit documentation, and I'm just like, oh man, how bothered can I be to substantiate this? And I have to get back in touch with my old school, and I'm sure they'd help me just sending me the calendar of all the PD and stuff that we did, but I'm also just like, what would be the point? So I don't know that I would necessarily go back, but I'd like to kind of have the opportunity to go back at some point. So I mean, it's kind of like one of those things where never say never, but I would definitely find it hard to imagine. And the opportunities that I've had at the moment, they're just tremendous. There's an inquiry happening at the moment in the Victorian Upper House into the state education system. Because I have this job, I was actually able to pour my heart and soul into this 20,000 word submission that just tackled a lot of the issues as I saw them, both drawn from my experience in a real teaching context, particularly the comments that I made around early career teacher registration and just how bonkers and workload intensive that is for no real benefit. So, but also some of the more practical stuff around, this government program's not very transparent, or we don't know enough about whether this works, or here are the things that the government's pushing that aren't effective, or those sorts of things. So I'm really, I feel really blessed that I was able to write that, and that I was actually able to present to the hearing on Thursday. So last week I was able to do that. next month in June, I'm one of the speakers at the Age School Summit, which is, a really tremendous opportunity. And I probably have like sort of one speaking engagement or presentation or something a month, and that, enables me to really reach out to a whole heap of different people, because there's so many teachers out there, and sometimes teachers just want someone that kind of knows a little bit about their context, isn't going to act like they know everything, but is still knowledgeable enough to bring different perspectives that they can consider and work with and work on in there, and sort of just take that and play with it in their own context. And I'm hoping that that's something that I can do. And obviously the capacity for influence there is tremendous. And, teaching at a private school like I was most recently, sure, I was, I taught like 100 kids or whatever across, sort of 3 different year levels, 5 different classes, or however many it was. But, how many kids how many kids' lives was I really making a material difference to? I don't think it was that many, just because of the nature of the kids in the room. Whereas if I'm speaking, doing one speaking engagement a month, if I can influence a change in policy, then that's potentially thousands of children that can benefit from that. So, it just kind of, you never know where the future goes, but at the moment I'm feeling pretty good about where I am.
Awesome. Well, your the 2 reports that you just released were excellent. Highly recommend for teachers to read them. I mean, basically, sort of you're advocating. It's kind of a direct instruction approach based or informed by cognitive science. So, like, it's the science of learning. But it is, I guess, can I squeeze in a couple of quick questions about that? One of the issues maybe that I thought of, and that I saw this during my teaching time, was that we have a fairly flat hierarchical culture in Australia. I know, like, there's subgroups that have a more like a more hierarchical culture. Uh, I found I was basically working institutionally in a hierarchical system, whether it's from the policy top down, and even in the school, it's kind of hierarchical as well, and the teacher to the student. But our culture, the prevalent culture, was fairly flat. And so, do you think? I guess, it depends on how good the teacher is, and obviously trying to implement this effective system, this science-based system. But do you see the culture as being a potential impediment, and Australia's culture accepting sort of a rollout of a fairly direct instruction approach?
Can you just repeat what you said about the culture? Like, in what sense?
Yeah, so basically kids and parents being fairly familiar, kids and teachers being fairly familiar, sort of, not as respecting the kids, not as respecting the teachers and parents as much, and the value of education not being imparted on the kids as much. It's sort of more child-led, child-focused,
Yeah.
parents as friends, or that sort of thing, rather than a slightly more old school culture, which is more respectful for authority.
Yeah, I definitely think that I mean, it's hard to know, right? Because I'm really reluctant to sort of make grand sweeping claims about the nature of kids today or parents today without the data. Like, it's sort of, the more inclined I am to believe something, the more I want to challenge myself and be like, well, where's the data, Trish? Is this just your prejudice speaking or whatever? But I mean, I will putting all of that aside, I will definitely say that I have noticed. I do feel like there's definitely a cultural differences, and like I sort of compare that to my own upbringing, where my parents were very, very strongly motivated by education and the value of education. But, I went to an academically selective school, so the that was probably not so much in a demographic where that was not the case. But, the culture around my parents and my school upbringing and my school culture versus the culture in the room with some of the kids I was teaching, there really just wasn't that same unstinting focus on education, particularly that long game in education where you're doing some things now that you may not like or that you may not enjoy, but with the guarantee of a payoff at the end. Whereas I think for a lot of people, especially if they didn't finish high school or they didn't go to school or they didn't really feel like they learned much in their formal education, they may not be able to see those payoffs. And obviously that's sort of something that kind of can trickle down into whole cultures and whole communities. But I think that's actually where the school needs to take leadership, because I don't think a school can just sort of say, oh, you know, the parents in our community don't value this and we just need to sort of match their preferences. And I actually think that that's not good for society, because what will happen is that there'll be schools in wealthy areas where that's not the parents' culture. The parents' culture is probably more similar to what I was raised with. And that those schools are going to really push their kids, and they're going to have the chairs in rows, and they're going to have like a warm, strict approach to discipline and classroom behaviour. And they're going to have a really kind of intensive approach to learning and making sure that kids are learning in the room, and that being like kind of the core purpose of the school. Whereas it's not, I don't think it's fair that in other towns we might just sort of say, oh, you know, these kids are the kids of high school dropouts or tradies or people who may not be holding down steady jobs, and they don't value education. Our community doesn't value education. And so our job is to kind of give these kids the basics, you know, teach them how to read and write and do maths and do the basics, and then let them leave and go and do something else if they want to. Whereas I feel like and while I do respect that there's going to be kids for whom they'll get to that age of 16, 17 and they'll say, this isn't for me, and I would completely respect that. But what I think is important is that the school does, you know, till you're sort of at that age, 16 or 17, it shouldn't matter whether you go to school in Horsham or Hawthorn. Like it's a sort of thing that I think the state system should be delivering, I guess, equitable opportunities in terms of teaching and learning, regardless of what the kind of natural preferences might be. And the reality is that even if we live in cultures where we feel like things are a little bit less hierarchical between like parents and teachers or parents and friends, try that with your boss and see how far that gets you in the real world, because I think that there's a lot of kids that would have been kind of in for a rude shock in the real working world.
Yeah, me included, probably. I've got a million more questions, but I'm a man of my word. I want to keep to the hour, so we'll wrap up. Do you have any, whether it's blogs, books, podcasts that you'd recommend that you think are important for teachers to look at? And then also you can refer us to your contact pages as well. And maybe actually before you answer that, the first question is, could you explain your Twitter handle, the meters gained? Where does that come from?
Yeah, sure. My Twitter handle, The Meters Gained, it's actually a song by The Herd, which is an Australian sort of hip-hop rap group. And they have this album called The Sun Never Sets, which is kind of based on that old quote about the British Empire, you know, the empire on which the sun never set. And so it's sort of, I kind of found that out, like that album is called, the whole concept album, kind of appealing because of that historical story it was trying to tell. But also the song, The Meters Gained itself, is kind of about like the futility of war. So that trench warfare, it's like, you know, obviously the meters gained being a sporting term, but they're talking about it in the context of intractable trench warfare, where you're measuring gains by meters and you're not, and obviously the losses are being measured in lives. So it was just something that, you know, the kind of thinking I was doing at the time, I can't remember when it was that I changed it to that years ago, but it was just something that, you know, I thought it was an interesting piece of art that kind of melded some of the things that I cared about, like history and how we think about warfare, and also those big ideas about, you know, life and death and glory and things like that. So, yeah.
Look, I think that's an interesting one, and it's probably it's aged well, and I think it's aged better than a lot of the old daggy emails we used to have when we started out with emails. So I think it holds up well, and it's mysterious. So you've now spilled the beans. But anyway, yes. Recommendations and where to find you. Do you have...
So you can find me on LinkedIn. So my name's Trisha Jha. I don't post a whole lot, but I do every now and then. Definitely my most casual space is Twitter, or X, as is now technically called, where I am, as you said, the meters gained. And on that, I think you can find links to my CIS profile, where it's basically my author profile, which will have links to the papers I've written, the op-eds and other commentary, and also other things like the podcasts I've done. So if you're a podcast person, you can look up the Centre for Independent Studies on your podcast app. And there's a couple of podcasts that I've done about my recent papers. And the papers are quite long. So one's 12,000 words and one's 20,000 words. So definitely give the podcast a check out if you prefer that. Otherwise, I have been on some other podcasts and I tend to post those ones that I've been on Twitter as well. So yeah, Otherwise, cis.org.au and just search for me under the researchers tab.
Awesome. Thanks, Trisha. That was just great. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt. See you later.